The title of my talk today is The Silence Between the Tracks, and as already mentioned, I'm going to be talking about technology, but also I want to pick up on some things that Raymond wrote about in the exhibition catalog for today, for the exhibition that's on presently. And I want to pick up on some of these things because I think there's a link between the way he understands the art world and his own practices in relationship to it and technology, and I want to try and see if I can tease out some of the connections between them. To begin with, though, I want to just start with a little bit of silence. The rituals surrounding the playing of a recorded music has changed dramatically in the recent years. This is certainly not the first time in recent memory that the activities associated with music production, distribution, acquisition, collecting, handling, playing, and listening have changed. But that these activities have all more or less changed at the same time and so dramatically is perhaps only comparable to the introduction of the phonograph and the gramophone over 100 years ago than anything else since that time. Take, for example, the simple playing of an LP, an act that called into play a certain number of actions, a certain kind of ritual with regards to the first choosing a record to play, placing it on the turntable, and engaging the stylus. These simple acts were often as not done in silence, the quiet preparation for the sounds that were yet to be produced. And if the apparatus created its own noises, the hum of the motor as it began to bring the turntable up to speed, the bump and crackle of the needle as it came into contact with the vinyl surface, then that was also part of the medium, the assertion of the physicality and specificity of the vinyl disc as a support structure for the reproduction of music. One of the things that has changed in the digital age is the very idea of a physical support for recorded sound. While I agree with Jonathan Stern when he writes that despite the immaterial character of the MP3 file, we still tend to consider them as objects. We buy them or otherwise acquire them, and we collect them. This may only be the force of habit, a certain way of speaking, a way of mentally grasping at what cannot be physically grasped. What can be said about digital audio as a technology is that it has an extremely low physical profile compared to what preceded it. And to a larger degree, the digital audio file, whether it is stored on a hard drive or on silicon chip, has become absorbed within the playback apparatus itself. It is buried along with all the other instructions and data within the computer or mobile playback device. But there are other aspects of this change in the support structure of music reproduction that are both physical and musical in character. Take, for example, the space between the recorded tracks. Playback media of the past, whether in the form of LPs, cassette tapes, or CDs, all required a certain consideration for the space, the duration and time that would separate one piece of music from another. This is not a trivial matter. Sorry. Reading from these things is not simple either. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. This is not a trivial matter. The space between the tracks is not a dead space. It is, even more than that silent moment when the needle first hits the place at the beginning of the record, a highly charged musical space. A space in which the lingering echoes of that which has come before mingle with the anticipation of that which is about to sound. This is a space that has to be planned. It is typically one of the last tasks that mastering engineers and producers undertake when they complete an album. And in most cases, the duration of that space is variable, the precise duration relating to the feel for what is appropriate to the circumstances. It is also a space that with repeated listening, we also become accustomed to. We learn to anticipate the duration of these spaces, and they become, in a sense, part of the music. Glenn Gould once said that in the days of 78 RPM records, when works were actually divided up into separate discs, He became accustomed to waiting for the next disc to drop in the middle of the work, so much so that later on, when he learned to play these works, he would instinctually pause briefly at those moments when the music demanded it. By comparison, iTunes and other programs that help organize MP3 audio files insert a fixed duration, 2 seconds, between every track. And while the user can program this to a different duration, the space tends to be uniform. One size fits all in the endless flow of music. iTunes even lets one program a crossfade between these tracks so that one need not ever experience any silence at all. This new way of sequencing reproduced sounds marks it as a technological practice, perhaps even a technocratic one, rather than a musical one. And it seems to me that there's a loss in these moments of silence that is quite a great loss for all of us. In many ways, it seems to me that the work of Raymond Gervais inhabits the space of silence, the space between the tracks, a space that is at once a consequence of the physicality of the recorded medium, but also a hardly charged space of musical memory, imagination, and anticipation. The retrospective exhibition of his work and the catalog essays accompanying it make it clear that there's been a marked tendency in the overall trajectory of his work from sound to silence. And while I would not disagree with this, I would argue that it is not necessarily a movement from being a musician as such to becoming more of a visual artist. Much less would I say that this is indicative of a movement towards greater abstraction in his work. It seems to me that this trajectory is more the result of a deep commitment to musical and visual culture as essentially integrated artistic activities, and also to the object status of music in its recorded form, and to all the implications of that status. I want to return to the idea of sound recording as an object a bit later, but first I want to examine a few aspects of Raymond Gervais' work as he describes it in his essay in the exhibition catalog. The primary impression that I come away with when reading this essay is that of a personal history, a history of profound influences drawn from family, friends, chance encounters, and more deliberate mediated encounters with literature, art, performed and recorded music. And also a history of similar influences and encounters as they relate to the ongoing history of modernism in the 20th century. A modernism within which he is also keen to trace the role of Quebec and Quebec artists. And just as an aside, I think it's interesting the degree to which the movement of Quebec artists to New York, to Paris, and it is part of this story. And it kind of works against, I think, conventional art histories that tend to be very nationalistic in character, and it kind of argues for a kind of history that works around the notion of migrations and movements of people as opposed to their fixed artistic practices in given spaces. That he tells this story in a personal mode, through a more general idea of personal encounters rather than more conventional art historical categories of styles and movements, is, I think, neither by chance nor is it without consequence for his own work. This mode of historical narrative stems in part, no doubt, to the fact that he is primarily self-taught, and in this sense, his discourse is relatively free of the constraining categorizations that tend to dominate academic study of most topics. His historical knowledge is thus of a more inclusive, less hierarchical, encyclopedic type that is perhaps characteristic of the collector, specifically the record collector. I would not, however, jump to the conclusion that this is simply a manifestation of a kind of hyper-musical connoisseurship on his part. It is more profound than that. It is, on the other hand, certainly a necessary condition for his creative practice, insofar as the encyclopedic character of Raymond Gervais' historical knowledge allows him to make surprisingly yet always pertinent associations between disparate facts and artifacts, and that these associations can then become the basis for a combinatorial process that results in a highly individual form of art making. The role that personal influence plays in Gervais' practice is unique, and it begins, perhaps not surprisingly, with his father. In his essay, Raymond remarks on the profound influence that his father's interest in sound recording technology had on him at an early age. This story reminds me of a similar story of the influence that is often told in relation to the early modernist American composer Charles Ives and his father. In his case, his father, a band leader, encouraged his children to sing in different keys, introduced them to the clash of multiple marching bands and the music of Stephen Foster. The connection here is not just one of inspired parenting, but one of attitude. For all his professional training, Ives never became a full-time musician and continued to draw on his early experiences for inspiration. In this sense, he remained a kind of autodidact, and his music resembles, more than anyone I can think of, the same kind of associational characteristics that mark the work of Raymond Gervais. I just want to play you just a brief excerpt of some of his music. This is Charles Ives. Raymond makes reference to Charles Ives and this particular piece actually in one of his works. The influence of his father on Gervais is just the beginning, of course, of a vast array of other personal contacts, from his uncle who introduces him to jazz, to his many friends and associates, and to a range of more mediated influences that come to him via literature, art, and most importantly, the recording medium itself. In this sense, Gervais' interest in jazz is perhaps most significant, and is equally significant that a great deal of its influence comes to him via records. Gervais tells us that he worked for a time in a Montreal record shop, a warehouse. And to some degree, it is that his experience of both the recorded jazz is a source of his appreciation for the music, but also his interest in album covers as vehicles or sources of works of art. And the significance of recording for jazz itself is indisputable. As Gervais rightly tells us in the liner notes of his work, Le Festival International de Jazz Imaginaire, the history of jazz is unthinkable without the record disc. The spiraling movement of the disc, so unpresupposing as it might appear as we look at it now, is thus of utmost cultural significance for Gervais. It's a movement that evokes the image of a tornado in his work, a force of nature ripping through the cultural landscape of the 20th century. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Gervais' life and work, with this play of diverse influences, is that it becomes for him a vision of the art world and its inner operations. For Gervais, the history of art is not the result of a series of autonomous movements, style changes, and revolutions. It is, on the contrary, the result of a constant interplay between artists of all kinds, musicians, writers, dancers, painters, and sculptors, whose most inspired moments come about not only in the practice of their own art, but equally as a result of both chance encounters and longer-term engagements with other arts. The most significant moments in art history are those moments when the definition of what is music or art is up for grabs. And it is only through a breakthrough in those rigid categories that a way forward can be found. In this way, Gervais' vision of the art world and its history resembles, for me, a book written many years ago by Roger Shattuck called The Banquet Years. And in the Banquet Years, Shattuck paints a kind of portrait of late 19th, early 20th century Paris and the raucous artistic scene, including Le Douanier Rousseau, Eric Satie, Jarret, and Apollinaire. As a historian, his account of their individual works is less important to him than the character of the exchange between them. And it is precisely this kind of exchange that makes Gervais' encyclopedic of knowledge of the movement of art and artists so essential to his work. And it seems to me it's also one of the things that makes the character of his work a kind of homage oftentimes. It's almost as if he has to pay tribute. If you wear your influences on your sleeve, you have to pay tribute to those influences. So there's a kind of shouting out, a kind of constant kind of pointing and acknowledgement of those that went before and those who are significant. An example of this kind of thing, if I can offer one, if there's not already enough in Gervais' own work, is Morton Feldman. Aside from his associations with the composer John Cage and other composers, Feldman is often associated with the work of visual artists. You'll notice on this album there are two works, one devoted to Mark Rothko, and it was premiered and written for the Rothko Chapel, and the other for Frank O'Hara, who was a writer in New York. And it's interesting in this sense, Frank O'Hara himself is a kind of a multi-artist. Although he was known as a writer, he was trained as a musician, he was quite a good pianist, he was also a composer, he was involved in mounting a lot of artistic exhibitions in New York. So there's a kind of sense in which O'Hara's life and Feldman's life are intertwined in their interests in other arts and how those influence their own practice. Feldman, for instance, when speaking on the liner notes for this Frank O'Hara piece, speaks about how he is interested in his music reflecting a kind of flat surface. And he's specifically thinking of the flat surface of contemporary painting of the period. Let me just play a little passage here. And the flat surface that Rothko speaks about here, and in the Rothko Chapel liner notes, he talks about filling the room with sound and silence in a way that a sound recording does. That the sound recording is somehow more intimate than the conventional concert space, where there's a distance between the audience and the platform, a distance between the audience and the stage. And it's these references, it seems to me, in the comments about sound recording and artistic practices, visual artistic practices, that marks Feldman's music in a particular way, and in particular the kinds of ways in which he works with silence. It seems to me, like Gervais' work, his work inhabits a space between the grooves, a space that is silent and has its own particular physical dimensions, its own topography. That space and time is part of the groove structure. It makes it more like music than, it seems to me, the MP3 files and digital audio generally. There is a duration in this sense that is central to sound, music, and the sound recording. For John Cage, rhythm and time were the most essential parts of music, more so than pitch, which goes against the grain of the entire kind of historical structure of music theory and analysis, which is primarily concerned with pitch. He thought that time and duration were important because it's the only way that you can achieve a null moment. Pitches are always either C sharp or D sharp. But with pitch, there is no sense of silence. With duration, you can have a null moment. You can have a space of nothingness. So in that sense,
time and silence are the essence of music. And it seems to me that's also the essence of Feldman's work and the essence of Raymond Gervais' work as well. The present state of recording casts Raymond Gervais' work in a new light. It is, ironically, a work of the past, an oeuvre devoted to a kind of experience that we can no longer have in quite the same way. Recording took music, that most ephemeral of art forms, and made it into an object. A commodity, to be sure, but an object that has inspired a range of visual artists like Gervais, Christian Marclay, and others to work with it in its object form as a kind of visual art as much as a sonic one. Today, digital audio has made music rather more ephemeral again, still reproducible, but remote and intangible to a large degree. And that, to me, is a great loss for all of us.